Welcome to this special edition of Living Out Front with me, Amy Hunter, the Executive Director of OutFront Kalamazoo. With me today, I have Delaware State Senator Sarah E. McBride. I'm so excited that you are here, Sarah. It's been so long since we've seen one another.
It's
How are
great.
you?
It's great to see you. I am doing well. I am enjoying my time in the legislature, but I'm missing seeing so regularly so many of my friends in the movement and in the community around the country. So I miss everyone. So it's really good to see you.
Yeah. So it's a little bit different being in the legislature from being out in the advocacy world, huh?
It is, in some ways it's very similar, and in some ways it's very different. It's certainly different because one, I was used to traveling constantly in my old work and visiting
Right.
movement partners and community members around the country and in some cases around the world. And so obviously I'm a bit more localized to one place now, but also in some ways it's very similar because I think as an advocate, I felt like I was representing a community. I was taking the hopes and dreams and needs of a particular community with me as I went to city halls and state capitals and the US Congress to advocate for LGBTQ equality. And now I'm similarly taking the hopes and dreams and needs of a community, the first Senate district, with me to Dover. And yes, I'm sitting on a different side of the conference room table, but there's actually a lot of overlap. And I feel like I was well prepared for this work through my time in advocacy and through my time in the movement.
I remember when I first saw you, when I first met you at a Victory Fund event. I remember thinking, and I think I actually tweeted this out or something, put it on Facebook, that was watching you speak and thinking, this woman can do anything she puts her mind to doing. And I was not surprised to see you running for state senate. Delaware has always been home, is that correct?
Yeah, so I have the privilege. I look out here because I'm in a condo and I can see I'm on the 10th floor and I can see the actual neighborhood that I was born and raised in from
Really?
from my condo. I can see the trees outside my childhood bedroom window. So I'm representing a community. I'm not just from Delaware. I'm representing a community that I was born and raised in, that I grew up in, that has supported me and sustained me throughout my life. And now, it's very kind of you to say that you thought I could do anything, but I think I, like so many of us, never believed that to be true, especially as a kid. And I always tell my neighbors, I say, don't be startled if you see me walking around, sort of wiping my eyes and tearing up a bit, because sometimes I will literally just walk around my district and tear up at the fact that I have this opportunity to represent them as an elected official, as my authentic self. It's deeply moving because for so long, I never ever would have believed that I would have this privilege.
Mm-hmm. That story sounds at once familiar and all too often spoken by other trans people that have found the opportunity and perhaps had the privilege of being able to come out and do this kind of work. What I know that the circumstances around you coming out were extraordinary also. You were at American University at the time and president of the student body. And didn't you come out rather publicly?
I did. I came out this was 2012, spring of 2012. I came out publicly at the end of my term as student body president at American University in an op-ed in the student newspaper, which sort of went the 2012 version of viral. I would say it got a lot of coverage. I was really scared when I came out. I think like so many people, it's still, even in 2012, just 9 years ago. My goodness, just 9 years ago, still seemed that it was impossible for a trans person to be out and run for office, serve in, positions of influence and in roles that allow you to create change within government. There weren't a ton of examples of trans people publicly who were living their truth and finding opportunities to lead in their broader communities, on the news every night. As they say, it's difficult to be what you can't see. And so I was very nervous, but obviously, fortunately, there's a lot we don't see. And one of the things that happened very quickly was I was introduced to a community, a trans community in this country, that showed me very quickly that you can be trans and you can pursue your dreams. And there was still a long way to go. There still is a long way to go. But I came out standing on the shoulders of generations of trans folks who had blazed trails. And I came out to a campus community that was really loving and accepting. And I think for me, in reflecting on that experience and how overwhelmingly positive it was with family, with friends, and with my campus community and my community here in Delaware, I was sort of left feeling this was the hardest thing that I had ever done, but it was still relatively easy compared to the experiences of so many other people in our community. Mm-hmm. And that I felt a responsibility. And I don't think every trans person always has to feel a responsibility to be an advocate, but I personally, in my own individual experience, felt a responsibility to get involved in advocacy to help ensure that the experiences that I had were no longer a privilege for the few, but a right guaranteed to all of us.
Mm-hmm. And the work that you've done has helped so much. I know I too felt that way, that when I came out, I had a tremendous amount of privilege and realized very quickly that my story was very different from that of a lot of other people that I met. And so I found a new moral imperative by coming out fairly late in life, unfortunately, much later than you.
Remind me what year you came out?
I came out in 2006.
2006. Yeah. I mean, to think about the difference that we've seen as a community between 06 and 12 when I came out, between 12 and 2021. I mean, mm-hmm. It's not that long ago in both instances, but it really does feel like in many ways, not in all, and certainly not evenly felt, but it does feel like, we were coming out in almost a different world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So you have a very successful book that I confess I haven't actually read the whole thing because I don't know, I don't find time to read.
Yeah, I hear you.
But what I have read of it is it's very moving, it's very stirring. And you speak of coming out and the work that is yet to be done. You speak also of your late husband, Andy, and how that has affected you. Would you speak about Andy a little bit? I knew Andy. I was doing some work with Andy when he got sick, and I miss him. I miss him too.
Yeah,
as I'm sure you know a lot of people who must miss Andy. He's a great guy.
He was a great guy, and I remember you were doing work with him. I think of you as both a friend of mine and a sort of comrade of Andy's in the work, because I know you were working with him near the end of his life. Andy was incredible. He was the kindest, one of the smartest, one of the funniest people that I had ever met. more than that, he was one of the goofiest people I had ever met. And that's like a super important qualification for a partner. Like just super goofy. You know, you just I feel like when you can find someone who you can just be the goofiest human being with, that's when you know you're home. We met at a White House Pride reception. And when I say we met, more accurately, we bumped into each other at an Obama White House Pride reception. And he fortunately reached out to me a couple months, maybe 2 months later over Facebook and essentially asked me out. He said in the message that he thought we'd get along swimmingly. And I thought, who the hell says the word swimmingly?
Swimmingly.
24-year-old here in the States says the word swimmingly. I feel like he's like a 70-year-old British man. And I was actually like, that's actually exactly who I want to go out on a date with, is someone with that, with that older soul. And so we went out.
We'd get on rather well, I think.
Yes. You know, you're both young and young at heart. But he was, I fell in love with him really quickly. He was just as good as a person can possibly be. And when we met, he was working as an attorney at an organization fighting for healthcare for the LGBTQ community, particularly trying to get trans folks access to medically necessary healthcare and for it to be covered by insurance as it should be, and as that care is covered in so many instances for so many other people. About a year into our relationship, as you know, he was diagnosed with cancer. I think similar to coming out, one of the things that I really think about and reflect on was, despite the fact that Andy was going through treatment for exceptionally serious cancer, I was serving as his caregiver. He was 20, 25, 26. I was 20, 22, 23. One of the things I think about is how lucky we were, how lucky he was to have health insurance, how lucky we both were to have jobs that allowed us to keep our income while we focused on the full-time job of Andy getting care and me being there to help care for him. He got a clean bill of health. We both went back to work. We were working at that point at the same place, fighting for non-discrimination protections, fighting for healthcare for LGBTQ people. And then about 8 months after he got a clean bill of health, he developed a really persistent cough that we eventually learned was his cancer, that it had come back, that it had spread, and due to those factors, it was terminal. And so when Andy didn't have much time left, he asked me to marry him, and we married in a beautiful ceremony on the rooftop of our apartment building with just a rainbow assortment of friends and family, really all family, blood and chosen, presided over by Bishop Gene Robinson, who I know so many folks know through his trailblazing work as an Episcopal bishop and an openly gay man. And then 4 days after we had that beautiful ceremony, Andy passed away. And you know, one of the things that I think about when it comes to Andy is just how humble he was, because it really took his passing for even me as his partner to fully understand his impact, to fully understand how many lives he had touched. I mean, the messages that had come that came in from all across the country, from advocates, from elected officials, from trans folks who had been able to access care because of his work. It took him passing for me to even see just how many lives he had changed, and in some cases, how many lives he had saved through his work. But then more broadly, you know, what I take from that experience and my love for him is the sense of urgency when it comes to the work that we're doing. The sense of urgency around the fact that every single day matters, and that when we're asking trans folks or LGBTQ people writ large, or really anyone, to sit back and allow for a slow conversation to take place before we treat them with dignity and ensure them opportunity. We are asking people to watch their one life pass by without the respect and fairness that everyone deserves, and that is simply too much to ask of anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that relationship, my love for him, left me forever changed, and it lit a fire under me in the work that I did in the months and years after. And to this day, as I wear my wedding band 6 or so years after he passed away, it's wild to think it's been that long. I continue to feel that fire to try to bring about as much change as quickly as possible.
Right. That's an incredibly important lesson, I think. I knew Andy as a very, very generous and exceedingly smart man, and I'm still using some of the things that he taught me in my work today, and helping to bring healthcare and dignity and respect to other folks in the trans community. So his legacy lives on through a lot of us whose lives he touched. And he probably thought he wasn't doing enough, would be my guess. Yet he touched so many people's lives and taught so many of us so much. It's amazing. So, and it's a very inspiring yet at the same time sad story. Yours and Andy's, but it's heartening for me to see that you took away a lesson about the fierce urgency of now from that.
And another thing that I took away, there are a couple quotes that folks said to me in the final month of Andy's life that I think about a lot. I remember Mark Kiesling, who was just wrapped up her time as executive director of the National Center for Trans Equality, and it's a dear friend. Is a dear friend of mine, was a dear friend of Andy's. She was at both his wedding and his passing, and then his funeral a week after the wedding. And one of the things she said about our wedding was it was the most tragic, beautiful thing she'd ever seen, and his passing was the most beautiful, tragic thing she had ever seen in her life. And what both of those instances for me encapsulate more than any other is something that my brother said to me in the final month of Andy's life, which is, and he's a radiation oncologist. He said to me, this is going to be incredibly difficult, but that I should take stock in the acts of amazing grace that would fill my life. And to both Mara and my brother's comments, that grace, that beauty was everywhere. And I think it has allowed me, and I've been thinking about it a lot during the course of the pandemic, right? It's allowed me to see the world through a new perspective, to see the grace in the challenges, to see the beauty in even in tragedy, to recognize that hope is an emotion, right? When you think about it, hope is an emotion, as a phenomenon. It only makes sense in the face of hardship. And I think about, I love Mr. Rogers. I think about the quote that Mr. Rogers used to say, which is that when he would see something scary on the news, his mother would tell him to look for the helpers. And so for me, it's left me with a sense of urgency, but it's also left me with a unique optimism, because I can't help but see the goodness even in difficult times. And I think it's because of that last month of Andy's life that my sort of perspective on the world has just so fundamentally shifted in a actually very positive way.
Tomorrow is going to be different.
Indeed. Well, and as I say in the book, the one thing, a lot of times people say the only constant is change. The one thing we know is that tomorrow will be different. And it's
Right.
question is, will it be better or not? And that to make it better, to bend that arc of the moral universe toward justice, it's on all of us through our individual and collective actions to make sure that more tomorrows are better than today.
Mm-hmm. So there was a deliberate shift for you into politics, away from advocacy. What spurred that?
I think a couple different things. One, Andy's passing, I think, really, one, left me with that sense of urgency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Two, I think, left me recognizing the need to seize the day, not just in how fast we bring about change, but in what I want my life to mean and what I want to do. And if none of us know how long we have and what is a meaningful life. I mean, I think one of the things we as trans folks and more broadly LGBTQ folks grapple with from a really early age is sort of these existential questions of what is a meaningful life? What will we want at the end of our lives to look back on? I know for me, even at like 10 years old, I was grappling with, I remember I was in a college interview and I answered that question and the college interviewer was like, that's a little heavy. But I think you can't help but really grapple with that. And I think as someone who has thought about that a lot in my life, and then to see Andy pass away at a young age in his 20s, I think it left me going, yes, I might be young. And there are a lot of positives in that perspective in legislative halls and in government. But personally too, I don't know how long I'm going to have on this earth. I don't know how long I will have. And I want to seize the day. I want to try to make as much change as possible. And I think I saw that government from a really early age, government was the place where you could make the most amount of change for the most number of people in the most number of ways possible. Mm-hmm. And it's the place where every avenue of society converges. And so I for those reasons, for my gratitude to this community that I now represent, that has been by my side as I've come out, as I've faced, loss and as Andy and I faced his cancer, wanting to give back. All of those, I think, came together to push me to decide that I wanted to run. I wanted to take that next step. And I'm so glad that I did. I as I said at the start, I miss my movement friends, but it is an extension of my movement work. It's an extension of my advocacy, because ultimately the work that you were doing, the work that I've done, it's not about an abstract moral principle. It's about making sure everyone can get a job that pays a good wage, healthcare that meets their needs, an education that prepares them for the future, for them to be able to live in communities where they're treated with dignity and where they're able to find safety. And ultimately, that's what all of the issues that we're grappling with in state government, city government, at the federal level. That's what public policy is about.
Mm-hmm. It also seems to me, from looking from the outside, seems to me that your moment had arrived. If you were going to make that shift, that you had been on the world stage. You were widely known. You had spoken at the 2016 Democratic National Convention, which was an amazing speech, by the way. I'll remember that moment forever, just cheering you on. And it seems to me that the moment had arrived for you to take that next step in what seemed to be a natural evolution for you. And when you won your race in Delaware, I was so excited. I was just so excited. I really never doubted that you would win, frankly, knowing how articulate you are and knowing that what you didn't run on your uniqueness as a trans person. You ran on an agenda around healthcare, correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah, I long said during the campaign. I mean, I knew that because of my work and because of my identity, my transness was going to be something that certain segments of society, it's all that they would want to talk about. It's what my opponent would want to talk about, and it's what the media would want to talk about. But I knew it's not what voters were ultimately going to want to talk about. And frankly, it's not why I decided to run. I mean, if I wanted just to work on non-discrimination protections, not to say just, but if I wanted to keep working in that specific sphere, I could have continued doing my old position. But ultimately, I wanted to really have a meaningful role in all of the different policy solutions that intersect with the LGBTQ community, with my neighbors outside of the LGBTQ community. And I wasn't running to be, the transgender state senator. I was running to be a state senator who was focused on healthcare, paid family and medical leave, and that's how I've served over the last 6 months. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not working on non-discrimination protections. In fact, just yesterday, I was on the steps of the Delaware General Assembly with a House Majority Leader introducing legislation that would amend the Delaware Constitution to explicitly add sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability to our state's Equal Rights Amendment. We have protections based on sex, race, color, and national origin. And we've now introduced legislation, which fortunately in Delaware, our constitutional amendment process doesn't have to go to a public vote. So it just has to be a bill that passes with supermajorities in 2 successive legislatures. And so we've introduced this bill. And if it's added to the Constitution, we will be the first state in the nation with explicit sexual orientation and gender identity constitutional equal protection language. Which is very exciting. And so I'm still working on these issues, but I ran talking about the issues that I knew were impacting people across my community. And then ultimately, I feel very strongly that the only way I can do justice by the trans community is to be the best state senator that I can be for this district.
Right.
My transness informs that. My transness enhances my capacity to do the job for a number of reasons, but I won't be doing the job that my constituents expect of me if all I'm doing is talking and working on issues that are explicitly and directly related to my identity. The priorities have to include the needs of all of my constituents, including my trans constituents.
Did that come up during your campaign? Did anyone say, well, all you're going to do is work on equality issues?
There were people who so my opponent's campaign, and I won't say my opponent because I think my opponent was a decent person, and I think there were people in his campaign and in the Republican Party who took advantage of his candidacy to attack me, and I don't think that was him. I think it was people who worked for him or worked with him. Ultimately, obviously, the candidate holds the responsibility, but I really think that people who took advantage, and they certainly attacked me. They went after me, not so much for my identity, but they would say that I wanted to teach sex acts to kindergartners. They would utilize my friends to this day still jokingly invoke that attack against me because it's just so ridiculous. But you
how's that going?
I mean, right. You and I both know, right, that feeds into an implicitly anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ narrative. I wanted to indoctrinate children. I wanted to sexualize, components of society in their mind, right? They utilize these anti-trans tropes, and it really was I think more difficult for my family than it was for me. I mean, I was kind of used to it, but my family, I
Right.
think I had shielded my family from a lot of the attacks I had experienced as an advocate. But I couldn't shield them from the attacks I was experiencing as a candidate because they are voters in my district.
Right.
And so, I think it was more difficult for them. They couldn't wait for it to be over. But ultimately, it didn't really come up in conversations with voters. The few instances, and really you can almost count them on two hands, where my gender identity came up during the course of the campaign in conversations with voters, were two broad categories. One was, a voter with a genuine, had heard, read an article about me, knew I was trans, had a genuine, earnest, good faith question about gender identity. And,
Mhm.
it wasn't always my favorite thing to have to engage on. I would rather talk about my policies and whatnot.
Right.
Always, I would answer with patience and grace. And I will tell
Mhm.
you, I think in almost all, if not all of those instances that there were those questions, those folks ended up voting for me. But then even more frequently than those questions were people who brought it up because they were excited. They were
Right.
excited about diversity, more diversity in government. They were excited about the message our district could send to trans young people. They were excited about the fact that they know that government works best when it reflects the full range of experiences and backgrounds and identities of the communities that it seeks to serve. That ultimately you can't craft effective solutions for diverse constituencies if you don't have the full diversity of those constituencies represented in the conversations. That's true in business,
Right.
it's true in technology, and of course it's true in government.
Right. Doubly true in government when, to not just have a voice at the table, but have an actual seat at the table, have a place set. I'm so excited to hear that second part that you're talking about, because that reflects a real change from, when I came out, and certainly probably even when you came out, that people were actually excited that, excited for the candidacy and the message that could send. Even though you weren't running as a trans person, you were running as a problem solver.
Yeah.
There's still a unique symbolism there that I think a lot of people celebrate. So our time grows short, Sarah. What's next for you?
Well, we're entering the final stretch of the General Assembly here in Delaware. So what's next is voting on a budget and a capital improvement bond bill. What's next is advancing legislation that I care about, that I'm working on right now, ranging from funding for youth reentering society from our juvenile justice system to expanding support for youth in and aging out of foster care, to making sure that every Delawarean can get the healthcare that they need, including Delawareans who are undocumented, including Delawareans in the LGBTQ community, Delawareans with disabilities. I'm chair of the Senate Health and Social Services Committee, and so making sure that every person can get the care and support that they need is at the heart of my work in the legislature. Ultimately, what's next too is also passage of my key piece of legislation that I'm working on, which is Senate Bill 1 in Delaware, the Healthy Delaware Families Act, which would provide 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave to Delaware workers. Because I think throughout the pandemic, we've seen that no one should have to give up their income in the face of illness or a major life event. And that's a piece of legislation I've been championing through the campaign and now through my time in the legislature. And I'm excited to get back next year to pass it through the General Assembly and hopefully make it the law of the land here in Delaware.
Well, that certainly is a worthy cause. So, are you going to run again?
I'm running for re-election. So typically senators' terms here in Delaware are 4 years.
Right.
But because of redistricting, everyone is up in 2022. So I have a 2-year term. So I am up in 2022 again. We'll be running for re-election in whatever sort of newly drawn district I'm in. And I'm excited to hopefully have the opportunity to continue to serve my neighbors.
Well, it certainly sounds like you will come through this session with a record to run on. And I couldn't be more excited for you.
Thank
So,
you.
Sarah, thank you so much for being so gracious with your short amount of time that you have, with your busy schedule. And it is so great to talk to you and see you again. It's been too many moons since we've talked. And hopefully I'll get out on the East Coast and can have some coffee and find time to squeeze me in for coffee.
I would love that. I would love
That
that.
would be
Come visit
great.
me in Delaware, and I'm sure we will also see each other at some point in person at a conference or a gathering of some kind in the near term too. Now that we can all return in person for things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's good seeing you, Amy. Thank you so much, and always a pleasure talking with you.
Pleasure talking with you too. Thank you for being on Living Out Front.
Thank you for having me.